Executive Director for Child Care Aware of America, and I'm excited to have you here with us today to kick off our 5-month campaign. Child Care Aware of America today is kicking off our 5-month campaign to help shape the ongoing national conversation around various opportunities that enrich the state of child care and early education in this country. The Raise Your Hand webinar series strives to raise awareness about federal and state early learning opportunities that support child care, connect participants with content experts, and inspire all who care about early learning to take action to better the lives of working families. With all of the excitement surrounding early childhood policy building significantly over the last year, our goal is to make sure that you have access to experts across the early childhood community to discover what exactly is going on in Washington, D.C., and how you can be involved. To do this, we've invited leaders from national early childhood organizations such as the First 5 Years Fund, 0 to 3, and the National Women's Law Center, the National Head Start Association, and many more, to help all of our communities understand what's possible and what's at stake for our nation's littlest learners. Today's webinar, Federal Budget 101, Budgets, Deficits, Sequestration, and Shutdowns, will be presented by Stephanie Monroe, who is our policy and budget expert here at Child Care Aware of America. Stephanie has had a distinguished career. She has 25 years of experience working on the Hill. She is currently president and founder of the Renwood Group, a Washington, D.C. government relations firm, where she advises clients in a wide range of matters in the education and health arenas, including early care and education, K-12 and post-secondary education, small business, and workforce-related issues, and health care. And she has decades of legislative and executive branch experience, most recently as Assistant Secretary of Education, where she was responsible for the Office for Civil Rights. Before I turn it over to our presenter, I want to point your attention to the chat box, which should be on the right side of your screen. Please use this function to submit or ask questions, and we will be sure to address those questions at the conclusion of this webinar. Thank you so much. Without further delay, I turn it over to our expert, Stephanie Monroe.
Thank you, Lynette, and welcome everyone to this Federal Budget 101, looking at budgets, deficits, sequestration, and shutdowns. As we all know, the federal government is in a bit of a quagmire when it comes to the budget, and so today's webinar could not be more timely. While Republicans and Democrats on Capitol Hill continue to play partisan politics over Obamacare and a government shutdown, their antics are threatening the nation's commitment to providing working families access to high-quality child care needed to ensure that they can work and that their children can enter school ready to learn. Draconian budget cuts known as the sequester went into effect earlier this year and have cut funding for these critical services. Right now, Congress is continuing to consider multiple bills to keep the government from shutting down, or at least to reopen the government, while a longer spending bill is negotiated. But unless we put pressure on Congress to stop the sequester, which is scheduled to extend into 2021, deep cuts in children's programs are likely to continue for years to come. Secretary of HHS Sebelius estimates that sequestration could leave as many as 30,000 children without child care, 70,000 without Head Start. And unfortunately, the precise impact on the Child Care Development Fund and the timing of the cuts is difficult to quantify. Why? Because unlike a purely federal program like Head Start, the Child Care and Development Fund is a block grant designed to give considerable control over spending to states and other public and private agencies. In order for us to be impactful, we must have an understanding of the process in order to make strategic decisions about when, how, and what to communicate to decision makers. So this webinar is designed to give you an introductory look at this complicated process and empower you with the tools that you need to leverage it to ensure that the interests of families you serve are protected. So what is the federal budget? So the federal budget is a concurrent resolution that's passed by both houses of Congress, the House and the Senate, and it sets forth, reaffirms, and revises the congressional budget for the U.S. government for a fiscal year. Concurrent resolutions must be negotiated by the House and the Senate, and an agreement must be reached but they do not require a presidential signature because they are not laws. Budget resolutions do not need to be laws because they are basically a legislative device for Congress to regulate itself as it works on spending and revenue process. And in terms of the context of what's happened this year, both the House and the Senate passed a budget. The House, though, refused to appoint conferees to resolve the differences between the House and the Senate budget, and therefore we do not have a budget that has been agreed to by the House and by the Senate. So looking at the congressional budget process, on the left side of this slide you will see what is the regular order process, which you probably have heard or read about, the regular order. This is the general way that we would proceed in enacting a congressional budget and appropriations bills. On the right-hand side of the screen, you will see a list of essentially what happened and what is happening with the 2013-2014 budget. So we see that on the left-hand side of the screen, the President's budget is required to be submitted the first Monday in February. The President actually, in 2013, did not submit his budget until April the 10th, which was 6 weeks late. Any one of these areas that's listed where timing does not happen when required can in fact cause a delay in the process and have a trickle-down effect. And so that was the beginning process where the President's budget came down late, although the House and Senate had and did report and pass their own budgets, but not reconcile them as discussed previously. The next big action that takes place in terms of the budget process is consideration and passage of annual appropriations bills. And the House is supposed to complete action on their annual appropriations bills, and there are 12 of them, 12 separate appropriations bills, essentially funding the 12 largest agencies and sometimes combined agencies. So, for example, the Labor, HHS, and Education Appropriations Bill funds the Department of Labor and the Department of Health and Human Services and the Department of Education in one bill. So that should have been completed on June the 30th. In fact, the Senate did complete action on it. The House has still yet to complete action on their appropriations bills, and so you see that that deadline was missed. Hence why we are now at a place where we did not pass in the House and Senate all 12 appropriations bills, and when that happens, we end up having to pass what's called a stopgap measure or a continuing appropriation. So let's back up for a second and look at the budget process and what happens when we miss some of these deadlines and what the different steps are to better understand sort of where we are and why we are where we are today. So the President is supposed to submit a budget to Congress on the first Monday in February, and then, as we've said before, the House and Senate negotiate and pass their budget resolutions. These, again, don't have to be signed into law. They are guidance and not binding in terms of legal provisions of law. Step two would be that the Congress and the President would reach an agreement on the 12 appropriations bills before October 1st, which is the beginning of the new fiscal year. So an appropriations bill is a statute that's passed by the House and the Senate Appropriations Committee that generally provides authority for federal agencies to spend money and to make payments out of the Treasury for specified purposes. And again, there are 12 regular appropriations bills. So we know from this process that the House and Senate and the President did not reach an agreement before October 1 on these 12 bills. So therefore, we go to step three. So in step three, if Congress fails to pass the appropriations bills on time, then Congress and the President can agree to an interim continuing resolution. That would be a bill that would extend temporary funding beyond the beginning of the fiscal year until negotiators are able to make decisions about full-year funding levels. So for purposes of what's happening today, Congress was considering doing a short-term, an interim continuing resolution. The plan was that that interim resolution would take us from October 1 till approximately December the 15th. The Senate passed that continuing resolution. The House of Representatives refused to take up that individual bill, that clean CR, and instead has begun a process of trying to pass short-term continuing resolutions with additional provisions that the Senate has said they would not accept. So therefore, we have failed to appropriately address Step 3, and so now we move to Step 4. In Step 4, if Congress does not pass the 12 appropriations bills on time and fails to enact a continuing resolution, then the result is a gap in funding, which means there's no authority for funding of the federal government or its activities. Failure to fund the government and its activities will lead and has led to a government shutdown until such time as Congress and the President can reach an agreement to fund the government. So we need to think about the federal budget process as like an orchestra. It's important that all of the instruments play in harmony, that they come in on time, that they stop on time. When they don't do that, everything gets out of whack. And this year, that's exactly what happened. A comedy of errors, and we're now in a situation where we are currently in a government shutdown and are waiting to see if the House and the Senate and the President can in fact resolve their differences and enact at least a short-term appropriations bill known as the CR. So what's the difference between the budget and an appropriations bill? So as stated before, a appropriations bill is a statute that's passed by the House and the Senate Appropriations Committee that provides specific authority for federal agencies to spend money and to make payments out of the Treasury for specific purposes. The budget, on the other hand, is the authority that Congress gives to government agencies that permits them to enter into obligations. The budget is a concurrent resolution. It's a bigger document. It does not specifically address individual programs. For example, the budget would address the overall Department of Health and Human Services. The budget would not specifically state the amount of money that would be available for the Head Start program. That would need to happen through an appropriations bill. So sequestration. In general, sequestration is an order that requires spending to be reduced by uniform percentages. Sequestration, for our purposes, was created in August of 2011 as part of the Budget Control Act of 2011. And it was the result of Congress's inability to reach an agreement on funding the federal government for the full year and to meet our obligations to pay debts owed by raising the federal debt ceiling. The hope was that the threat of a universal across-the-board spending cut would result in Congress reaching a compromise to avoid what virtually everyone agreed was a terrible outcome. So unfortunately, no agreement was reached, and Congress is now forced to accept $1.2 trillion in automatic spending cuts, split 50-50 between defense and domestic discretionary spending over the next 10 years. So which programs will face cuts? Virtually all programs will face cuts unless they are considered a mandatory program. A mandatory program, often called an entitlement program, which provides sort of critical supports for children and families, would be shielded. And these programs include Social Security, federal retirement payments, veterans compensation, Medicaid, Pell Grants, food stamps, supplemental security income, and veterans health benefits. So the other term that we're hearing lately is the debt ceiling. And the debt ceiling, according to the press and according to Office for Management and Budget, we will reach that debt ceiling by October the 17th, requiring Congress to act. The debt ceiling was created in 1917, essentially as a mechanism that Congress used to allow the Treasury Department to issue Liberty bonds to pay for part of World War II. In general, if the government is unable to generate enough incoming revenue through taxes and other income producers, it has to borrow money to finance its obligations. In order to be able to borrow this money, Congress must from time to time raise the debt limit. In a debt limit impasse, which we have experienced once and will likely experience again in a few weeks, Congress has not agreed to allow the government to borrow this additional money, which results in the government no longer being able to finance its obligations. Now, if this occurs during a period when the government is running a deficit, which we are currently running a deficit, then the dollar amount of newly incurred federal obligations would exceed the dollar amount of newly incoming revenues. If this happens, the result may be delays or defaults in the federal government paying its obligations, which may result in disruptions in government operations, in furloughs, and other types of reductions. The debt ceiling really is used to force a conversation between the President and Congress to become more accountable in determining the fiscal policy for the United States. Without it, the annual U.S. budget deficit pushes the national debt higher and higher, and that's because there's very little incentive for politicians to curb government spending. For this reason, the conversation about the debt ceiling was usually very brief. Congress and the President simply agreed to raise the debt ceiling, but in the last 10 years, Congress has increased the debt ceiling 10 times. If you look at debt ceiling history, you'll see that Congress usually thinks nothing of raising a debt ceiling. However, occasionally, and more in recent days, Congress delays raising the ceiling for political reasons. This occurred in 1995, 2002, 2003, most recently in 2013, and also in 2011. And it will occur again around October the 15th. So mandatory spending we've discussed in terms of the spending that would be excluded from sequestration. It's important for our purposes to know also that half of the Child Care Development Fund spending is mandatory and therefore not subject to sequestration or other cuts. So why would a government shutdown occur? Why are we in this position that we are in today? First, because if Congress fails to pass the 12 appropriations bills, then the government has no funds to pay government workers. As a result, federal agencies aren't able to remain open, and essential services of the government may not be able to continue for those workers. So looking specifically at child care and early education programs under sequestration, this chart shows what was essentially enacted in 2013, in the fiscal year 2013. The center shows where we are in terms of what the Senate has passed, in terms of the programs that we're interested in. And as I said earlier, the House has not reported a bill, and so there is no bill in the House to be moving forward. But as you will see in the first line, CCDBG, the Child Care and Development Block Grant, will be increased by $3 billion, or I'm sorry, $300 million in the Senate if the Senate bill passes. Unfortunately, this chart is really illustrative only. The budget that's currently being examined and being considered will maintain at least 2013 levels, if not slightly less than that. So the congressional cycle at a glance. Again, wanting to show that all of these different things that Congress is engaged in is really cyclical, and everything is dependent on each other. And at any one time, if one of these, if there's a breakdown in any of these, then we in fact have a problem. So the process really can start anywhere. You start with a program. You start with an idea of creating a new program or continuing a program. The first step really at that point should be an authorization. Should be going to the House and the Senate, figuring out and legislating the purposes of the program, the parameters for that program, setting the amount of money that will be needed to operate that program, is authorizing the maximum amount of money that they feel is needed to operate that program. Any types of checks and balances, reports, information they might need from the states, all of the things that they would need to know to determine whether the program is in fact working and to evaluate the program to decide whether its continuation is warranted. Usually authorizations run from 3 to 5 years, and you would expect at the end of that reauthorization cycle for the House and Senate to take up that bill and to make changes that were deemed appropriate and then extend it if it was deemed worthy of extension for the next 3 to 5 years. So we have an authorization bill. We then have the authorizers working with the Budget Committee, working with the President, working with the Office for Management and Budget to make sure that the federal budget recognizes what's been authorized and includes enough funding in the budget to allow those program functions to go forward. That's why the budget process is so important, because it is essential to authorize the actual funding of the programs that Congress wants to continue. The budget then sets, as I said, the overall structure, the overall limits and caps on what would be generally made available to those agencies. You then have a very specific appropriation, which then specifies by a line what funding would be available for specific services. So you'll be a specific line for Head Start, a specific line for Child Care Development Block Grant, a specific line for Title I education programs. That would be through an appropriations bill, which says, yes, authorizing committee, you've said that we should create this program. Budget committee, you said that the agency has X, Y, Z in terms of allowable funds. We are now going to allow the agency to actually appropriate, to actually spend money for a very specific purpose, which is to carry out what this authorization bill is intending to have happen. And then you have oversight hearings. And oversight hearings should happen by both the appropriations committees and the authorizing committees. And the purpose of those hearings is both to oversee what's happening with specific agencies, but also what's happening with specific programs. Are the agencies using the money that was given to them wisely? Are they overspending money? Are there issues with contracts that we might want to be concerned about? It's an opportunity for the agencies to tell the appropriators and the Budget Committee, we actually need more money that you gave us, or we'd like some flexibility in terms of moving around money within our agency because we see different types of priorities that maybe Congress hasn't thought about. And the authorizers also want to do oversight committee hearings. They want to know that the program is working as intended. They want to hear from people in the field who are actually operating the program. Does this program need to be changed in some way? What's working, what's not working? What do the evaluations show us? Is this program worthy of extension? And so working together, the authorizers, the budgeters, the appropriators, and the oversight hearings that would take place is the perfect sort of the orchestra of how this should all work. One of the things that we know is that the Child Care Block Grant hasn't been reauthorized in many, many years, that the Senate is poised to pass a bill, that the House has not even introduced a bill authorizing it. We know where the budget is, that we haven't had a budget in several years that's been passed by both the House and Senate. With appropriations, we know that we've seemed to every year, in the last 5 or 6 years at least, been in a situation where we've not been able to pass all 12 appropriations bills. And so we've been forced to do these short-term, stopgap, continuing resolution bills in terms of funding. And yes, there are oversight hearings that are happening, but where do they go from there? And so it's a challenge. The point of this being, we hope, we're working, Child Care Aware is leading efforts in Congress to make sure that your voices are being heard in every one of these phases, that you have an opportunity to impact the authorizing, the budget, the appropriations, and the oversight, and the administration of the program within the administration, so that our priorities are heard. So with this, I think I want to thank you all for your attention, and we'll open for questions.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. This is Michelle McCready with Child Care Aware of America's policy team. I just wanted to thank Stephanie for explaining so concretely the overview of a very complicated subject matter, and I hope you all have an opportunity and had an opportunity throughout to chat in different questions. We have a couple of them coming in, but if you haven't chatted your question in, please feel free. We have a couple more minutes for Q&A. So we have one about receiving a copy of the PowerPoint, and we will post this PowerPoint on all of our social media outlets, and you will also get a follow-up email with the PowerPoint and the link to the recording. Okay, so we may have a couple more questions coming in. There's one. Okay. Okay, here we go. So one question is, when should I start worrying about the impact of the shutdown on my local R&R?
That's a great question. And unfortunately, I think the answer is we don't know. We know that, as I said, half of the child care funding is through the mandatory side, and so that won't be impacted. States are doing different things as a way of making adjustments that they are able to, because this is a block grant. And so in some cases, we see states reducing, they might be reducing their quality set-aside. They're allowed to go down to 4%. They might do that. Most states are currently spending 12%. They may decide that they're going to, reduce their commitment, their funding of quality in order to maintain slots. They may decide to raise income levels, the eligibility levels. They may reduce or increase their copay. They may decide to decrease the reimbursement rates. So I think we will keep you informed as we are learning more about and we are watching to see what states do. But unfortunately, the answer at this point is we don't know, but we are monitoring the situation closely.
Great. And another question about how the sequestration and shutdown is going to directly affect centers with regards to programs like ZPK, federal food, school readiness, Head Start, the federally run program.
Yeah, the programs that receive all of their funding, like this from the discretionary side of the budget, are going to be in jeopardy, at least in the near term. And the problem is that because this is the end of the fiscal year, most of these budgets are flipping over. And so some programs may have reserved 30 days. Some programs may have reserved a larger amount of funding for that. But, for example, food stamp, we understand will be able to continue through October 31st because of a provision that was included in the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. Head Start, we understand some Head Start agencies are actually starting to close. Some of them will be able to remain open for another 30 days or so. Again, it's a situation where we sort of have to watch and see what the actual impact is.
Okay, a couple more questions about the copy of the presentation. We'll be sending out an email. Just to reiterate, we're sending out an email and the PowerPoint slides later on this afternoon, so you should see that, as well as we'll be posting it. We would love for you to spread the word on the social media outlets like Facebook and Twitter to make sure that we're spreading the word about what's happening with the budget. It looks like that's all you all have had during this presentation. However, if you do have any further questions, you can contact any member of our policy team, and we'll be working with Stephanie to make sure that we get you guys at the minute and up-to-date responses on how this shutdown, sequester, and budget decisions are impacting the federal programs that you are working closely with in your state. But thank you all. We had a great attendance on this webinar today, and we hope that you will continue to join us throughout our Raise Your Hand for Childcare webinar series. Thank you, and thanks to Stephanie. Have a great rest of your afternoon.